I can't remember the last time I spoke to someone who worked in the health service who weren't talking about their plan B, whether that was cutting down their hours, whether that was a one-way ticket to Australia, whether that was working in a completely different industry, whether that was pivoting to a teaching role or an academic role or all sorts of other things, because they realized that the current situation for them as a human being was untenable.
Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from pouring your coffee and emptying your bins, through to caring for a relative or delivering your parcels. You may see them as essential or frontline workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of Britain's most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in policy, inclusion, and research to understand their challenges and start to figure out how we can solve them. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the host of the Invisible Worker podcast. And on today's episode, I'm joined by Adam Kay. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We're doing a deep dive on the NHS today and talking about life inside the UK's largest employer, because 1 in every 20 people who are in work in the UK work for the NHS. And you started out life as a junior doctor and have since become a comedian, writer, and in fact, a BAFTA award-winning writer. And I'd love for you to talk me a bit through your background and how you went from working in the NHS to where you are today.
My weird career trajectory.
Your weird career trajectory. I'm sure every doctor's out there aspiring to be just like you.
There's a lot of doctors looking for their plan Bs at the moment, as I'm sure we'll discuss. My story is, I don't know that I decided to be a doctor at any particular age. I think it was decided for me. It
just happened to you.
It was the natural thing for a person in my position, being a 16-year-old child in those circumstances, to do, in that I was from a family of doctors. I went to the sort of school that churned out doctors. Unless I had something approaching a better plan, that's what I was predetermined to do, which isn't a good reason necessarily. I went into medicine without, maybe the phrase is informed consent, because that's what, you need someone to do something to your knee. They say, here's the pros, here's the cons. If overall you reckon that the pros are better than the cons, sign here. I don't think going into medicine I had informed consent. I knew all the good bits. My dad had told me all the amazing stuff that he loved about the profession, but no one had said, it's not for everyone and it can be tough. And I don't think I was a bad doctor. I think I learnt to be good at the practical aspects of it, and I learnt to be good at communicating with my patients, and I worked on labour wards, and I got a huge amount of joy from that, and I delivered an awful lot of babies, and weirdly, some of whom I've now met. I'll do a live comedy show, and afterwards I'll do a book signing afterwards, and people will come along and I say, well, it's nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah. And then I think 3 times now, someone said, you won't remember this person, but you delivered them 17 years ago.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
It's very, very cool. It's also, from a business side of things, quite a good way to keep your audience going by sort of delivering more of them. But the aspect I hadn't really thought about was the sort of the emotional impact of the job on a human being, which is ultimately what led to me hanging up my stethoscope and my scrubs. It made me realise that I was made of the wrong stuff to do the job, and I stepped away. I think in my head I was stepping away for weeks or months. As it turned out, I haven't stepped back yet, and I found this new existence as a writer, initially of TV shows, then latterly of books, and then the books became more successful than my previous stuff I'd done, and then it spiraled from there.
You've become almost an official spokesperson for the NHS, for the people who work there, and particularly for junior doctors, because your debut book, This Is Going to Hurt, really lifted the lid on life inside the NHS for doctors in a way that people didn't really understand. And it really resonated.
It really did catch fire in a way that took me by a huge surprise. And I think what it did is, I think doctors were semi-invisible workers, sort of translucent workers, because we all have an idea of, it's not one of these job titles where you're like, what does a database analyst really do? We know what a doctor does because we've all seen doctors.
Of course.
But it's the bit you don't realise, which is what I think people were very interested in, sort of me peeling that back. And the ways in which doctors have it quite rough surprised people, I think. For instance, the fact that when you're a junior doctor, to use that term, junior doctors...
And it's not a junior role when you're a junior doctor.
It is not a junior role.
You can be in charge of life and death circumstances as a junior doctor.
I think the politicians have quite enjoyed the phrase junior doctor because people think, oh, maybe they're just like a medical student. Basically, it's anyone who works as a doctor who doesn't have the job title consultant or GP. So the day before you're a consultant, you're a junior doctor. So you can be in your 40s with a decade plus of experience under your belt and multiple degrees. And you are the expert.
Yeah. And you're a
junior doctor. So when you're in that junior doctor role, you get shuffled around the country all the time.
Yeah.
The country was divided up into something called deaneries, just a sort of geographical way of saying you're in east of England, you're in this, you're in that. And then every 6 or 12 months, you would get moved to a different hospital within that deanery, which made sense from like a training perspective, working in some big hospitals, some small ones, some experts in this, some experts in that. And then by the end of your training, you're the best possible version of yourself as a doctor.
Of course. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
That makes sense. However, the deaneries are big.
Yeah.
So like one deanery is called Scotland and it's tricky to find a flat that's handy for all of Scotland. And so unless you exist in a vacuum, it means you're always saying to your partner, to your friends, I'm off.
Yeah.
I'm moving 80 miles away. That's difficult.
Yeah.
Like you're itinerant in your working life, which has implications on the rest of your life, which means the rest of your life decreases in lots of ways. One thing that I realised almost instantly I started work as a doctor is how your social circle contracts. You're meant to be going out for drinks, you're meant to be going out for dinner, and you're meant to finish at 5. But you work on a labour ward and there's an emergency at 5 to 5. And there aren't all these extra staff. It's you.
Yeah.
And technically there's a choice of you leave the patient to fend for themselves and go, that's not a choice.
Is there really a choice though? You
would have never applied to medical school in the first place if that was a choice. You're doing the job to help people.
Yeah.
If your aim was to earn money, there are much more efficient ways of converting straight A's at A-level into cash than via 6 years at medical school, than a decade as a junior doctor. So you text your mate saying, I'm really sorry, I'm going to be 3 hours late or I'm going to cancel. Let's do it another time because this thing's happened. And they get it because, of course, you're their friend, the doctor. But after you've done it to the same bunch of people 2 or 3 times in a row, you've become the flaky friend. And people who get told they can't have the day off for their wedding because the rota doesn't allow it. People who have to cover their own sick leave. I was one of those people. You wake up in some kind of gastrointestinal distress. You're like, I'm clearly not going to work on a ward like this. And you text your colleague who's in charge of the rota, says, I can't come in. They're like, okay, we've sorted out this person to cover you, but you owe them a day. And so you end up spending a day of your leave repaying the person who can. It's chaos. It just becomes your normal.
Yeah, you don't question.
You don't have a denominator. You don't know what other people's jobs are like. And so that was my normal and every other doctor's normal. We know what it's like to be a doctor on the wards because half of TV programs are about some doctor on the wards and we get that. And they're good, they're accurate. But the bit that those shows tend not to be accurate about is what happens when the shift ends, what it's like when you get home, what it's like in terms of friendships and relationships. So I was an obstetrician on a labour ward for 7 Christmas days. And of those, I only got to see my family for 1 of them. I think when you're sitting down having your turkey, it doesn't necessarily occur to you that all the people who are staffing the hospitals, as well as all the other emergency services, our insurance policy always there, just in case something terrible happens with the carving knife or you go into labour or whatever it is and you need them.
And that's why it struck a note so clearly, I think, with so many people, was that kind of unseen look at the lives of people behind the NHS. I want to take a moment and reflect on the history of the NHS and kind of how it came about. Did you have to learn about this in med school?
No, there wasn't time.
That's
to cram in all these bits of the body and how they all go wrong. You're going to take us back 76 years.
I'm going to take you back more than 76 years, because although the NHS is officially 76 years old, its life started back in 1911 with the National Insurance Act by David Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Liberal Party then. And so that was a policy that created health insurance for workers. So not for everybody, just for workers. But that was the early roots of the NHS. And then fast forward to 1942, the Beveridge Report was a government commissioned report on social insurance and allied services. And William Beveridge was looking at 5 giants in the road to social progress. Not a man to mince his words. He talked about want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, and came up with kind of a far-reaching program of social reform that would provide social insurance from cradle to grave for people across all walks of life. And the idea for the National Health Service was one of those ideas, which in 1945, when Clement Attlee became Prime Minister from the Labour Party, he committed to implementing those recommendations. And then in 1948, the NHS was officially launched by Health Minister Aneurin Bevan. So that was 76 years ago. The idea was meet the needs of everyone, free at the point of delivery and based on need, not ability to pay.
Yes, exactly that. And interestingly, I'm very interested in the intersection of art and politics / real life. And it took a book, which was also then a film, to explain to the country that this was a good, exciting thing.
Mm-hmm.
A book called The Citadel by a guy called A.J. Cronin, who basically, it was a cautionary tale set in a Welsh mining village, not dissimilar from Bevan's background, about how bad things were before, and then this new scheme that came in this mining community where everyone's health was paid for by their employer, and then the guy eventually, so spoiler alert for anyone who wants to read some 1940s literature, eventually gets too interested in the dollar and goes and sells himself out to private medicine. It was a hugely popular book, which became a very popular film. And so by the time the NHS Act came in, it was a country who were like, oh, liken that film.
Yeah. Oh, we'd like one of those, please.
Yeah, we'd like one of those. That sounds good. Because it was a very big change. And to my mind, our greatest political success. You describe it perfectly. Free at the point of service, based on clinical need, not on your bank balance. What fairer way to apportion a health service could there possibly be than that?
They say that the measure of a society is how you treat your weakest members. And I think the NHS is an excellent measure of British society.
Absolutely. It's our proudest achievement as a civilization. And however it's performing at the moment, and it's definitely not at full strength, there is nothing wrong with the theory behind it. And any move towards a different model can only disadvantage people, because it can only be a two-tier system.
And there have been moves toward a different model, right? Especially in kind of 2012, the Health and Social Care Act by the coalition government was emphasising expanding the role of the private sector. And that's not the first or only example of the picking apart of the NHS. And it's a really complex challenge because it's this amazing institution. It is big.
It's beyond big.
It is unfathomably big. I want to talk about how big it is because it's kind of wild. As I said at the start, it employs 1 in every 20 workers in the UK work for the NHS.
Every single person knows someone who works for the NHS.
Absolutely.
Multiple
in your
people.
direct circle, you know many people. It's enormous.
And the budget's in the hundreds of billions.
Well, the budget for last year was £192 billion.
Some hospital trusts have budgets over 2 billion.
Yeah. I was trying to think of a way to express how big a billion is, because I think we bandy billions around. And I found this online. I can't claim credit for this, but if you allow 1 million seconds to elapse, that will take 11.5 days. 1 million seconds takes 11.5 days.
Yep.
1 billion seconds takes almost 32 years. It's so big. And so we're talking about hundreds of billions. And I don't even think we can wrap our brains around what a big number that is. There are over 1.5 million employees.
Falling every day.
Yes, falling every day. And they're estimated right now to have over 100,000 vacancies. It's crazy. The NHS sees every day 1.3 million people see a GP, 35,000 people call 999, 44,000 people attend A&E. I'm rounding, right? I'm rounding here. This is not exact. And 1,600 babies are born every single day. It's wild.
It really is.
It's wild. How can you possibly express what life is like inside such a big machine? And how can we stay true to that original vision? Can it be done?
So for me, the trick was zooming right into a singular experience, which hopefully other people, whether they worked as a doctor or when one of the other hundreds of different pieces of the jigsaw, hundreds and hundreds of professions that all need to work,
so
in chorus.
Yeah.
And I thought it meant I didn't need to generalize. It meant I didn't need to talk about someone else's story. I could just talk about, this is how I found it. There you go. And a lot of people got in touch saying, that was also how I found it, and good and bad ways. So I talk very openly about struggling as a doctor, particularly towards the end of the book, and I talk about how and why I left.
Yeah.
And I talk about being in a fairly bad place, and must have been hundreds of messages I had, either people writing letters to the publisher or in touch with me on social media and direct messages, doctors saying, until I read that bit at the end, I thought I was the first person who'd ever cried in a toilet.
Wow.
Because no one talks about it.
I would have assumed everyone cries in the toilet. I've read your book. I read it when it came out. And I come from a family of doctors as well. My mum's a GP, my sister's a nurse practitioner, my aunt's a doctor. I was actually
What happened? Why?
Do you know what? That was my one act of rebellion. I am the classic middle child. I'm the peacemaker and I'm very obedient and cooperative. And my one act of rebellion was I refused to do my parents' professions. So my kind of moderate rebellion was to not be a doctor. I think the idea of telling stories and talking about your personal experience really struck a note. And I know it did because your debut book was on several bestseller lists. And in fact, it was Waterstones named it one of their top 100 books of the decade.
Which, thanks, Waterstones.
Yeah, that was nice of them. It really did strike a chord and it really helped people understand what life was like inside the NHS, inside this sort of big, crazy machine that takes almost this sort of charity and goodwill of the people inside it to keep it running. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the unseen roles that the NHS really needs to keep it going.
You're right. There are some professions within the NHS who just get the top billing. We think of doctors and nurses and probably midwives and paramedics are other people that we interact with. But I would say the majority of the roles are under the surface. So let's go to my world of obstetrics. On a labour ward, generally if the doctor's called in, it means something's not gone entirely to plan.
You don't actually want the doctor.
You never want
to see the doctor.
Don't want to see the doctor. But doctor gets called in, worst case scenario, we're going to theatre caesarean section. Yeah. And in that room, there's the obstetrician you met. Standing opposite them is a second doctor, probably more junior to them. It takes two people to do you mind pulling that bit back and can you suck some blood? And then stood next to you is the scrub nurse who's passing you all the stuff. They're in charge. They know everything. In fact, it's such a difficult job. When I did the TV version of This Is Going to Hurt for the theatre scenes, we wanted to get everything accurate. We realised we were unable to train an actor or an extra to do the complicated handing of picking up the right instrument, passing it the right way. And in the end, we got actual scrub nurses on days off to come and do those roles because it's such a complicated, highly skilled thing. It's untrainable for an actor. Anyone listening who's been in a caesarean potentially didn't notice that person, and working with them as a healthcare assistant, there's a cleaner keeping everything clean. You've got the other end, you've got the anaesthetist, and with them is the ODP, operating department practitioner, and then over with the midwife who worried about the baby. Then you have a paediatrician, and they're likely to have some of the paediatric nursing team with them as well, who doubtless need a porter because no one's that mobile either because they're 4 minutes old or they've just had an operation. And so everyone needs wheeled around. It might be that you need some drugs retrieved from another department. It might be that you need to use something in the blood bank. And it's all of these crucial pieces of the jigsaw. We need all of these people. There are dozens and dozens of people involved with any medical procedure. A lot of them invisible. They need to start writing books, don't they?
They do need to start writing books.
And we'll know about them all.
Now that we know. And there's even more than that. I want to talk about money. And in your book, you talk about money quite a bit. And actually, I'd love for you to read for me. There's a passage on page 86, just to frame our conversation.
At this point in the book, I'm what's known as a senior house officer. That was the old terminology. It's been renamed into things like ST3 now because they want everyone to sound like a Star Wars robot. And so senior house officer, At this point, I was coming up to the halfway mark to becoming a consultant, I would say.
And so you're about 4 years in at this point, is that right?
At this point, I was 4 years in. I'd been a senior house officer in various different hospitals, moving around, obviously, to somewhere massively inconvenient every year or so. So this is me having a moan about money. I realise everyone moans about their salary and thinks they deserve more, but I'm happy to look back on my time as a senior house officer with a bit of objectivity and declare that I was profoundly underpaid. The money is utterly out of step with the level of responsibility you have, literally life and death decisions. Plus, there's the fact you've been to medical school for 6 years, worked as a doctor for 3, and started to accrue postgraduate qualifications. Even if you think it's appropriate you take home less money per week than a train driver, there's still the fact these working weeks can involve over 100 hours of unremitting slog, meaning that the parking meters outside the hospital are on a better hourly rate, which is something that a lot of people referred to when the book came out. Surely that can't be right. No doctor's badly paid, but it's out of step with what the job is, both in terms of the hours you're doing and the responsibility that it involves. And what I would say is, comparing me doing that job as a year 3, 4 senior house officer, the best part of 20 years ago, to someone doing exactly the same job today, I was paid about 35% more in real terms than they are today. And there's a lot of discussion about it. It's an extremely live topic, and hopefully one that's going to get resolved very, very soon. But for me, the argument about pay is one about fairness. Surely you have to admit it's unfair that people doing the job today are getting paid less in real terms than ever. And I don't paint a picture in this book of a particularly relaxing job, a particularly highly paid job in that role, but the situation now is demonstrably worse in almost every regard. And doctors are leaving. That's the problem. And I'm quite vocal on Twitter about all sorts of things, but pay is one of them. But it's not just about pay. Pay is part of looking after your staff.
Yes.
It's a big part.
It's pretty significant, right?
It's a pretty significant part, but it's not enough on its own.
Agreed.
They could get this pay rise that they're asking for, and I think they should get tomorrow. But unless lots of other things get sorted out, then it's not going to solve the problem of retention of staff, which is a very, very, very big problem. Last year, 40 doctors quit their jobs every single day. Far more doctors quit their jobs than retired. 9,000 doctors last year got in touch with the GMC, who are a regulator, to ask for a certificate that allows them to work in a different country. This is a crisis.
Yeah.
When I'm vocal on Twitter about this stuff, the number one reply from someone with a different worldview to me is, well, if you don't like it, then leave. But that's the problem.
That's what's happening.
It's literally the problem. And if enough people leave, you don't have an NHS.
Yeah.
Because the NHS isn't the buildings, and it isn't the CT scanners, and it's not the beds, it's the people. And the critical mass is the wrong word. It's the opposite of a critical mass. There is a point at which there are so few staff that the NHS can't perform its function. That's why sorting out this pay is such an emergency. You hear people saying the NHS was designed 76 years ago, the world was very different then, blah, 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 which is totally true.
Yeah.
And the argument is it no longer works in 2024.
No, I don't buy that.
And I don't buy that either, because it quite clearly did work a decade or so ago. And then it's probably not the place to get super political, but I'll get super economical.
Sure.
And talk about a concept called health inflation, which basically says that every year it's more expensive in real terms to provide the same healthcare than it was the year before. And that's because of lots of reasons. Populations in general are getting a bit older.
We're not as healthy.
We're not as healthy, which is a more recent thing. But because life expectancy until a year or so ago was increasing, there's more old people there. And
Do we
also,
do better screenings? We're finding things sooner that are more expensive to look after?
we're finding things more expensively because new screening and investigation modalities come in. Also, treatment modalities. Someone comes up with this exciting new treatment, this brand new drug. Chances are it's going to be expensive. All of this stuff makes your health service more expensive. So 3% in real terms, more expensive than the year before. Unless you increase your spending, and this is worldwide, by the way, we see this, unless you increase your spending by more than 3% every year, then the system gets stretched.
Yeah.
Anytime a government says NHS funding has increased 1%, 2% in real terms, what they're basically saying is everyone has to work harder because there are fewer resources.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of those 76 years, the NHS got more than 3% a year. As of 2010, the number dropped to more like 1%.
Yeah.
And then the numbers went very skew-whiff over COVID, obviously, because huge amounts of cash needed to be pumped in, and it's ultimately why there aren't enough staff. The system is designed to be able to cope with that. It should be. I'm not saying that you need to be seen within 20 seconds. It's not a deli. It's not
first come, first
It's not
served.
first come, first served. You get seen according to your clinical need. I think other than those horrifying numbers about the number of people who are leaving, a very unscientific way of looking at this is I can't remember the last time I spoke to someone who worked, or my mates who worked in the health service, who weren't talking about their plan B, whether that was cutting down their hours, whether that was a one-way ticket to Australia, whether that was working in a completely different industry, whether that was pivoting to a teaching role or an academic role or all sorts of other things, because they realised that the current situation for them as a human being was untenable.
It really would be such a shame if we can't reverse this, because even though things have been tough and things have been squeezed, in the last decade, I've been, again, a consumer of the NHS in lots of really positive ways. I've had 2 babies.
Congratulations.
Thank you. In NHS hospitals. I've been supported through a pretty traumatic miscarriage, which wasn't fun, but the support was there and that was great. And I've had a 5-night stay with a 5-week-old baby who had meningitis, which was, scary.
Probably one of the scariest parts of your
not
life.
fun. I didn't enjoy being seen very quickly when I came in for that one. You know, if you've been seen quickly, there's a problem there. But still, it was there. And I didn't have to think for a second about whether I would go in and make sure she was okay. I had no moment of thinking, well, actually, if I turn up to get seen, I'm going to have to pay whatever it is, right? Like there was nothing that stopped me from going to getting her seen. And
How's she doing?
She's great. She's a feisty 6-year-old now. I had the luxury of having an NHS that I knew would just see me and would treat me.
It didn't feature in your thoughts.
No.
Can I afford to
not for a second.
go in?
And I reflected on that. I thought, gosh, like how grateful I am. This wasn't part of my consideration set, that I wasn't sat there at home worrying and wondering, is it worth paying the money?
Can I show you a scar and tell you a story?
Yes, please.
Okay. So it's not a very impressive scar. It's on my knuckle there.
And a very nice ring. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a ruby ring for my daughter Ruby. She didn't get the gift. I got it for myself. I mean, the scar's on my knuckle, and it was obtained in the United States of America. It was the weird last day of the holiday where your flight's not till 1:00,000 and the hotel make you check out 1 second after breakfast and you're stranded with 55 bags. And it was Miami Beach.
Lovely.
We were by the pool. We were having our margaritas and we were having a lovely time. And then I went to the bathroom and then felt something in my hair. Some horrible Florida insect come to kill me. I sort of swiped it out of my hair, but it can't have been an insect because blood started jetting everywhere out of my hat. There'd been like a broken picture frame behind me, and like a small triangle of glass when I sat down had sort of just plumped into my hair. I'd somehow just unluckily hacked into some tiny little angry artery which started like fire hosing. I'm like, I have to stop this, and I can't stop it with toilet roll. It's bleeding through it, and there's blood everywhere. And there's way too much blood at this point for the size of injury. And I end up with this like a boxing glove of loo roll, sort of all the way around my hands, and my swimming trunks covered in blood. Not feeling particularly great. I wander back round to the swimming pool to James, my then boyfriend, now husband. Everyone starts screaming. Hotel manager comes over being very, can you go somewhere else other than my hotel? And it's still bleeding quite clearly. And everyone's agreed, I need to see some professionals. Doctors don't like seeing doctors. It's embarrassing. Like a mechanic seeing another mechanic. Come on. But this one definitely needs a doctor.
Yeah.
We get in a cab to the nearest emergency room. He's very nervously checking up these.
That was your cleaning fee. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I'm not risking my Uber rating over this.
No.
Get there. And so I've not been a patient in America, really. I'm used to the UK, where you turn up in A&E and they go, what's wrong with you? Or they take a good guess because
they can see you bleeding.
They can see you bleeding, or they can see your shoulders in the wrong place. But first question isn't what's your name or what's your date of birth. It's how are we paying for this?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I think I've got travel insurance with my bank. And they're like, yeah. I'm sure you have, love, but I have a credit card.
Oh, wow.
They're like, okay, fair enough. As it turned out, I didn't have any travel insurance with my bank. I was in a lot of trouble for that. At least it was only a finger rather than like an appendix or something.
How much does a finger cost to get fixed in the US?
Well, there's the question. It depends whether you go business class or economy, which is something that never occurred to me before, because my training was about doing the best thing clinically.
Yeah.
So I'm on the labour board. I think this is the problem. I present to the patient with my findings. At no point do I have to say, but option C is cheapest, so you might want to do that. Doctor comes over and says, hello, well, we need to get this sorted out because it was a glass injury and it's over a joint. Yeah. The risk is a bit of glass might have got into the joint. Do you want an x-ray? And I was like, I never really did joints, but I sort of vaguely remember, oh yeah, that's a thing. You're meant to x-ray it to check that, haven't got any muck in it. And he was like, but that will be however much it was, $1,500. And then when it came to closing the wound, it was like, we can either use glue on it or use stitches, and stitches are probably the better cosmetic result, but that would again be more expensive, and that isn't the way you should be thinking about how to treat someone.
No.
That person there must feel dirty bringing any of that into the equation. I chose the cheapest options, I think.
And so you have a scar and maybe glass in your knuckle?
Yeah, potentially. If there is any, it's not done me any harm. But yeah, it was probably as expensive as my week in Miami Beach, my little mini break on the last day to an emergency room. That's such a trivial thing.
Yeah.
But it's representative of a system with a problem, a system where the number one cause of bankruptcy is...
It's medical debt.
Medical debt. That's bananas. In my little British circle, I don't know anyone in my life. I know people who've had financial troubles for all sorts of reasons, and I don't know anyone who's struggled with their medical bills. And I hope I never will, because hopefully the NHS, as founded 76 years ago, will continue in that form, because any other system, as soon as there's an insurance company involved, as soon as there's a profit involved and shareholders, soon enough there'll be debt collectors.
And as soon as you put any friction into accessing the service, so even if you thought, well, if we just got people to pay £10, for example.
Exactly that.
That is the difference between someone thinking, I'll just take my baby to make sure, and thinking, can I pay the £10?
That often comes up. You just need to charge people if they go to A&E and it was nothing, or you just have to charge people if they miss an appointment. We'll just make it a £5. I write quite a lot about health, not just in books, but, I write the odd thing for a newspaper. The main comment under the line is that sort of thing. Well, I'll just charge them a £5. But for millions of people, a £5 isn't the difference between going to Itsu and going to the sandwich shop next door. A £5 is the difference between the kids eating and the kids not eating. It's the difference between the heating being on for the second half of the week or not. And it's been proven that it stops people accessing the care that they need.
I want to talk about pay in the NHS, which is particularly noteworthy because as we're recording this, there are some strikes going on or strike talks going on around pay. And the NHS has a long history of strikes, bearing in mind it was founded in 1948. From the 70s onwards, there's been a pretty relentless pace of workers striking over pay, including the first junior doctors' strike in 1975. But more broadly, when you look at the NHS as an employer, given the large number of people who work there, the 1.5 to 1.8 million people, you would expect it to follow a pretty normal distribution of the pay curve. But it doesn't. It's actually weighted towards low pay. So if you exclude doctors for a moment, 2/3 of NHS workers are paid below the national median wage. So the national median wage last year was just shy of £35,000. If you wrap doctors into that, still 57% of workers in the NHS are paid at or below the median wage. So the NHS is a low payer. The majority of people working there are being paid less than the midpoint in society. So it's not surprising there's been quite so many strikes over the years and that there are talks about pay right now. And I think even when you look at who these pay bands affect, newly qualified nurses and midwives, their healthcare assistants, their admin staff, their porters, their support staff. They're often estate and ground staff. And then junior doctors in their early pay bands are also paid below the median wage.
They've got people over a barrel because there isn't another NHS over the road that they can work for. And their rationale for taking the jobs will more often than not be a desire to help people, a love for the job. And it makes it all, to my mind, just very sad and smacks of an employer who knows that they can get away with it and knows that they have got away with it for decades. I really hope that things change. And I also find it sad that it gets to the point that these are professions who are striking. And I think, certainly speaking for doctors, I think that the only experience I have, it's heartbreaking to get to that point where a government was listening to them so little that that was the only tool they had left in order to change the government's mind. And it didn't affect the Conservative government in the slightest. I saw something from the Doctors' Union that suggested that it had pretty much cost the government more money in staffing those strike days than it would have done if on day one they'd just gone, okay, fine. And look, I don't think anyone's expecting it's a negotiation. It's not binary. We are on strike until you pay the exact amount that we're requesting. It's like, let's have a chat, let's find the way through this. But it seemed there was a failure of desire to even find the way through. So strikes were the reason that This Is Going to Hurt became a book. They're based on the diaries I'd written at the time, pulled together and with a bit of sort of chat in between.
Yeah.
Diaries that were sort of in shoeboxes and scraps of paper and post-it notes and exercise books in the bottom of the filing cabinets that I occasionally revisited to upset people at dinner parties with horrible stories, but I hadn't really thought...
Doctors have the best dinner party stories.
Oh, yeah. They'll cancel on the dinner party. They won't turn up if they could.
If they could make it, they have a great story.
They'd have a great story. Yeah. It never occurred to me that it should be a book or that I should be the person to write that book. Then it was around 2016, the previous set of doctor strikes. The doctors were protesting essentially a new contract that they said was going to be unfair, and the way it was going to affect their working hours would affect patient safety, which is essentially, that's why you do the job. Yeah. Because if patients' lives or well-being's at risk, then you have to say something. That's
you have to
your
do the
duty.
right thing. Yeah.
There was this situation that the government was spinning it, that all the doctors had just been greedy. Government was sending all their ministers out to the Today programme or whatever. Doctors were busy being doctors, working 92-hour weeks. And as someone who left the profession, but who knew what it was like working there, almost heartbreaking that I knew what the doctors wanted to say, but everyone I knew outside of medicine was hearing the government's very loud voice. And I thought that if I were able somehow to get out there these stories, then maybe next time round, people would be like, yeah, it doesn't sound right that they're being greedy because I read that book and these are their issues and this is what motivates them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had the kind of junior doctors strike that you referred to around 2015, 2016, and we're back here again. It seems like a topic that keeps coming up. It is one of the only ways that voices can be heard.
It just speaks to the fact that the overlords in the NHS have no interest in collaborative talks, because a strike is a failure of talking, isn't it?
You're right. It is a failure of talking. And it's almost disappointing it has to get to that. But as you say, the other choice is to leave, which doctors are doing.
Which they're doing.
And so it's important to listen to their voices. And there's a concept in behavioral science called anchoring. The first fact you hear about a situation, you latch onto that and that becomes the main fact in your head.
Yeah.
I really connected with that when you described the way you put your book out in response to these strikes and in response to the government calling doctors greedy. Because if that's the only narrative that people are hearing, they kind of anchor onto that and they think, well, actually, that is the story.
Yes. And that's increasingly become the way politics has been in the last couple of electoral cycles, hasn't it? The sort of, this is
the big headline fact.
The headline fact I'm going to repeat 1,000 times. Also, it sort of works because you end up with that word association.
Yeah, it's a clever way of getting people to align with your way of thinking. In the NHS, looking at the profile of workers and the profile of pay, there's something else I wanted to talk about with you today, which is pay is one facet of your contract with your employer. And then there's a broader set of support, whether that's mental well-being support or financial well-being support or whatever else that looks like in terms of the value exchange. The NHS brings in a lot of overseas workers. 35% of doctors are overseas workers, over a quarter of nurses and health visitors, 15% of medical support workers. It should be celebrated, that incredible complexity in people and the ability to bring people in to work in the NHS and our ability to attract so much work for overseas. One of the challenges that creates for the workers themselves is when you are new to UK, and I experienced this moving here over 20 years ago, you land here and you don't have any sort of financial ecosystem around you. You don't have a credit file in this country. You maybe don't have family or friends support.
Yes.
You don't understand how to navigate that.
Sure.
And the NHS is a hotspot for illegal money lending. And it's related to the high proportion of overseas workers.
Goodness.
So when you are thinking about illegal money lending or loan sharking, around 1 in 5 people meet their loan shark at work. It's a colleague. And the NHS is one of the top 5 sectors where this happens. This is something that's really sinister that I don't think is particularly well known.
I mean, that's I hadn't simply occurred to me that that was an issue. It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Mostly on the basis that there isn't much support across the board. And it would probably be surprising if the NHS was particularly good at one part of supporting their workforce whilst not being gold star across the board and
across everything else.
The number of people who are emergency taxed for like 6 months and inflexible rotas and
even paying bank staff often 8 weeks in arrears, waiting a long time to be paid, so having to come in and do the work and then waiting quite a long time.
That's ridiculous.
And there is
pay your freelancers. Speaking as a freelancer,
yeah.
Doctors, and I'm sure it's the same for nurses and other health professionals, but just speaking for doctors, have to pay their own mandatory exams and courses, which run to thousands and thousands of pounds through the year. Stuff like your GMC fees, it's like 600 quid or something. And if you don't pay that, then you're not registered with a GP and you can't have a job. So I say, well, surely
the NHS should pay for that.
If you have to have it for
that's
your
a condition
job.
of employment.
Yeah, you'd have thought so. And then if you're working in almost any medical specialty, rightly so, you need an up-to-date life support qualification. It's not like you've got pots of disposable income to start with, which makes it all the more agonising when it bleeds away in stuff that, as you say, is a condition of your employment.
Yeah. So here we are talking about some of the parts of the NHS which are suboptimal, but fundamentally really optimistic and positive about it. And we have a new Labour government.
We have to be optimistic. We have to be cautiously optimistic, but I think we can be optimistic on the basis that they can't be any worse than the last lot. And I've met Wes Streeting.
Yeah.
It was at a charity social thing where I think we were both presenting awards of some description. And he seemed dead nice and very smart. And I've obviously seen him speak a lot on the radio, and he seems all across his brief. I mean, he's had 3 years doing nothing but health in opposition. And one of the things that stresses me out the most is, oh yeah, we've changed everyone, and here's your new health minister. Don't worry, they used to do something in the treasury, but I'm sure they'll sort it out. This is someone who has a clear interest in it and understanding of it, but it's about actions rather than words, and we will see what the actions are like. But I'm remaining optimistic, whilst at the same time remembering something my dad always used to say. Anytime I'd be at medical school and there'd be a new health secretary, and I'd say to him, oh, what do you think of this one?
Yeah.
And he said that they're the worst one since the last one, which just generally proved to be right.
I'm glad to hear you're feeling optimistic about Wes Streeting in his post. He has, I'd say, an okay voting record. His voting record is pro-immigration, so he's consistently been pro-immigration, which is really important to the future of the NHS.
Yes.
He has voted against higher taxes to fund health and social care, so not good. It's one in the cons bucket. And he voted against reforming the NHS so GPs can buy services on behalf of their patients. I don't know if that's good or bad.
I love a voting record.
Yeah.
I would say that they're more telling when they voted in government than when they voted in opposition.
Got it.
Because I think quite a lot of the time in opposition, they decide to vote against a bill to be a contrarian. We shall see, and we shall cross our fingers. And in an ideal world, it wouldn't be up to politicians. I think it's too important. I think, however well-meaning a politician is, they're still thinking about their job in 5 years' time, aren't they?
Yeah, and they also not living the life. They don't have the lived experience, and they're not living the pay. So cabinet ministers are paid more than £150,000 a year. They're in the 98th percentile of earnings in the UK. So they earn more.
Well, I actually don't begrudge them that. But then again, I think so many people need to be paid more.
Well,
I mean,
certainly the majority of the NHS do.
Absolutely that, because they are so important. And there is more money in other places. And there was an advert in the BMJ, the rag for doctors, about a year ago. And I got texted this about 45 million times because it said, got this Dr. Adam K. Feely moved to Australia, was the title of the advert.
Wow.
And they obviously hadn't asked me.
Yeah. Did you shut that down?
Oh, no, just whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's quite funny. And it listed, I've never seen this otherwise. I don't subscribe to this magazine, and I would never look in the job section. But it was offering doctors for considerably fewer hours, $240,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
And you can see why you might get your head turned. And I'm not saying that's what we need to be doing here. I'm just saying that we need to remember that we're employing human beings who need to be treated with respect, and we're relying on their goodwill. And that involves some goodwill moving in the other direction.
Yeah.
And part of that is paying them, and part of that is making sure that they're supported and they've got a room to sleep in at night when they get an hour off, and making sure they've got a bike rack, and making sure that the car parking, if that's the only way they can get in, isn't going to cost them more than their daily wage. It's a lot of things.
It's a lot of things. I think that's a nice note to wrap up on. And so here on the Invisible Worker podcast, we explore the financial lives of the working majority. And the NHS is certainly a great example of that, not only due to its large size, but also due to the high proportion of people who have to go to work and who get paid sort of at or below the median wage. You've written books about this, but if you have one closing thought on what you wish people knew about the typical NHS worker, what is the one thing you want to stick in people's minds?
Looking back at everything I've written and everything I've experienced, one of my biggest surprises was a slight lack of humanity that I felt from the powers that be. And I think that this was best exemplified by someone whose fiance ended up on intensive care, and they were working as a doctor at the time. And they asked for compassionate leave, and they were told that according to their terms of employment, compassionate leave was for married spouses and first-degree relatives. And unfortunately, they didn't qualify.
Wow.
And for me, that summed up a lot of the issues that people have with, that's an extreme version, but a lot of the issues that people have with their HR. And I think these are people working in an environment where they're being kind, but they don't often necessarily feel that kindness back from their employer. And I think that's something that the NHS as an employer and as an organisation definitely needs to think about.
Needs to remember that people are people.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Adam Kay. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.